Hello, I'm Mike Fisher, a Milwaukee-based theater writer and dramaturg, and this is Theater Forward, a twice-monthly conversation about theater from a local, regional, and national perspective. From Madison, and this week also Milwaukee to Manhattan, we're excited to share insight into our own company while exploring issues surrounding theater in the Midwest and around the country. Welcome to episode 65 of Theater Forward. And this week, we're going to be having a conversation with Khalid, who is the dramaturg for our upcoming production. Actually, it'll have started by the time this podcast drops, of Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles by Adrienne Kennedy. Khalid is a professor of theater at Columbia College, as well as a longtime freelance dramaturg and a director. Khalid, welcome to Theater Forward.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I don't know if this is your experience, but when I tell people I'm a dramaturg, when they're asking what I do in theater, they just look at me funny, like they have no idea what I'm talking about. More often than I care to admit. So could you maybe help our audience out by just describing as a dramaturg what you do?
Yes, I get the same kind of looks all the time, actually. So I am right there with you. I think first and foremost, dramaturgy, more specifically being a dramaturg or serving as a dramaturg, it is a broad term that it's hard to define. I want to sort of start there. It's hard to define because there are various approaches, there are various areas or arenas in which a dramaturg may dabble in. So for instance, you have production dramaturg, which is sort of my role with Forward Theater's production of Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? You have translation dramaturgs. You have dramaturgs who specialize in adaptations and so forth, new play development, which is another area of mine. And so when folks say, well, what is a dramaturg? I always say, well, let me tell you what I do. And so I work at various theaters or with various theater companies on production. And so when they say, hey, we've decided to stage this play and we would like for you to work as our dramaturg, and if I feel, as if the relationship is right and the play is right, and this could be a wonderful opportunity, I say yes, and we move forward. And so in many ways, I become, to some degree, the scholarly expert on the play, on the production itself, areas of the production, I should say. I am sort of the expert in residence or scholarly expert in residence on the production history, the playwright, the cultural context of the play, things of that nature. But that's not. But the job actually sometimes is much more than that. So that's one area. Another area could be audience engagement, which we're doing a lot of that with this particular production of Adrienne Kennedy's play. And so that can include creating programming so the audience can have a more intimate connection with both the production and the play and so forth. That also includes sometimes serving as a specialist or a sort of, assistant to the director, not an assistant director, but a personal assistant to the director as it revolves around the play, the production, the playwright, and so forth. So in other words, there are times where I have worked on productions where before we even go into rehearsal, I'm working with the director. We're having meetings and discussions. The director may say, this is all brand new to me. I love this play, but there's some things I am just really unaware of. I don't know. And so I'm going to bring you in early so we can begin to have conversations and so forth. Another area is I have served as a script, not evaluator, but working with playwrights in developing scripts or new play development. I worked on a new musical a few years ago, and the musical was primarily about queer folks of color and trans folks of color. And the playwright was a queer white person. And the playwright says, I'm queer. However, my experience is limited with regards to race and class. And so they brought me in to do some work with the script. And so I would read the script and we would have conversations, and I would say, for example, I said one day, this is a really beautiful moment, but this reads like Dolly Parton. And these are queer trans people in the 1970s. And we're also talking about early drag balls and drag houses and so forth. And I said, this is Dolly Parton. And what we need is Sylvester and Patti LaBelle and Donna Summers. even with regards to the language and the lingo. So that kind of cultural context I was able to provide. And there, I mean, in dramaturgy, it's just such an expansive field, and it's growing as theater continues to grow. And so those are some of the areas in which I specialize in, and some of the work that I do. And I must say this, as a dramaturg, I am somebody who often, think that it's also wise when you are not a specialist in a particular area. And it's okay to say, this production or this play or this playwright, I am just not, that well knowledge in this area. And so I think that I perhaps can recommend someone else. And that's also, that's very important to keep in mind, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, boy, that's you really have covered the waterfront with that. And it's one of the things I love about what we do, is that it really is sort of all encompassing in that kind of way. You get to dabble in so many areas.
Right.
So with this particular production, let's talk about audience engagement in a second. But before we get to that, putting aside the audience engagement piece, how have you, in terms of what you've just described, served this particular production for Forward?
So, Adrienne Kennedy is a very special playwright. Adrienne Kennedy is not an easy playwright to understand. I teach Adrienne Kennedy's work often in various classes since over the various years that I've been teaching. And I've had students say, I just don't understand what's happening in this play, which as a teacher, that says, okay, I got to figure out another way to teach this important playwright and this work. Okay. But there's a similar approach to that as a dramaturg as well. How do I understand the work of Adrienne Kennedy? How do I understand Adrienne Kennedy's mind to some degree, her aesthetic, right? What it is that she's attempting to do in her body of work, whether it's written in 1964 or whether it's written in 2018. And I'm using that as sort of booking dates to think about her first play and her last play that she's written. But I want to start off with, I want to make a note that Baron called me, the director, Baron Kelly, called me and said, hey, and I know Baron from the theater world. He says, there's a show we're doing, Adrienne Kennedy, and we're doing her play, Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? And I said, oh, I don't know that one. I haven't read that one. And he said, I want to change the script right now. Take a read, and let's chat in 2 or 3 days. And if you know Baron will call you back in 2 or 3 days. Baron's like, hey, I told you I'm calling you in 2 days. Let's talk right now. And so, when Baron calls, I'm like, turn the music down, pull over, whatever you're doing, be ready to talk. And so Baron said, and this is when I was like, God, Baron is so smart as a director, because he says to me, so what are your thoughts? What do you think? Tell me, what do you get from this play? And I said, perhaps this is Adrienne Kennedy's most forward play, for lack of a better term, easiest play to understand. Because it delves in the realm of memory play and documentary theater. And I said, but if you think about Adrienne Kennedy's oeuvre, her entire body of work, this play still fits into her aesthetic because it is very much a fragmented play, even in her straightforward narrative. And I said, the visual elements are so necessary. And I said, gosh, and I was just talking out loud in conversation with her. And I said, whoever designs this play, they got to put some pictures up of the, the people that she's referencing, right? And the places that she's referencing and so forth. I said, this is a visual play. And I said, gosh, it's so Adrienne. And Baron says, yeah, I need you on this show. That's how it got started.
I love it.
And so I say that to say that, it is important to know that, this play falls in line with her body of work. And imagery, I think, is the term that we need to use and keep in mind. This play is very much steeped in imagery, so much so that when you're listening to Adrienne, the character Adrienne speak about her life and experiences during that time period, that, if you know it, it's so, it may resonate to the point where you just close your eyes and you can remember, smell, hear, right? Because it's not only informative, but her recall is so deep and detailed, that if you were there, you perhaps may actually remember your time there during, a particular experience and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, I got to admit, this is one I didn't know either until Jen Uphoff-Gray, our fabulous artistic director, brought it to my attention as something we might want to do. And I feel like when I first read it, it felt like a complete outlier to her canon. And I think, that's on me. I think I misread the play, honestly, because when you go back, and especially with all the work that's been done, the profiling of her and the bad choice of word, but the showcasing that we've had of her in the last year, you're really starting to see, I think, some similarities between other things. You've mentioned fragmentation. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Fragmentation in the context that, there is not a strict or straight plot, as you see with other playwrights, primarily in the context of realism and so forth, right? And fragmented in the sense that there are multiple moments, ideas, experiences converging, right, within the sort of umbrella narrative, right? So even though Adrienne Kennedy is talking about a very particular period in her life, so much was happening, right, that each of those moments can become a story in and of themselves on their own to some degree, but she converges them, right? One moment you're talking about Diana Sands, a very important actress who died too early. I truly believe that, I was introduced to Diana Sands with A Raisin in the Sun, Lorraine Hansberry as the original Beneatha, both the Broadway as well as the film version, 1959 theater and the 1961 film version. In the same conversation, 5 minutes later, Adrienne then is talking about Laurence Olivier, right? Theater royalty, and Diana Sands herself being theater royalty to some degree, but in the context of geographic location, and also distance in terms of race, right? Distance in terms of gender, they're very far apart, even their body of work and so forth. But all of those moments converging together, fragments, right? But your point that you made, Mike, a few seconds ago about this play not necessarily feeling as though it fits into Kennedy's larger body of work and perhaps her earlier works. But I think it does, right? Because this play follows so for lack of a better term, the recipes of Kennedy's body of work, in that it is very much a feminist work. It is very much a woman-centered work. It is very much a work that pulls from Adrienne Kennedy's personal life. I think many of us are so familiar with her early works where, because they're fragmented plays, often dramatized in this kind of, haunted spaces to some degree, right? Something about Funny House of a Negro, using these allegorical characters. I'm thinking about Rat's Mask, right? The Owl Answers, movie star has to be born in both black and white, right? Those earlier plays, right? But they are all centered around a particular person. And for Kennedy's body of work, that is a Black woman whose experience as a woman, as a Black person, right, is problematized or troubled, right? I should say troubled because of colonialism, because of racism, because of sexism, right? Because of gender dynamics and so forth. And so if you think about what Kennedy is doing in those earlier works, it actually makes sense that she finally tells her own story in this straight sort of manner, interview style, that we get to say, oh, your personal experience in this play really sort of illuminates what you were getting at in the earlier plays, Yeah,
that's just so right. And that's when I went back to it, I'm like, oh my God, this is the young girl in Ohio State Murders who wants to be part of mainstream culture and loves it and loves Thomas Hardy and loves all that, but feels like she's being shut out. This is the character in Funny House who is fascinated by European culture, has this room of books and stuff, but is feeling shut out. And that's, it's really, and that's, to me, one of the things that's fascinating about her body of work is it's not in any sense, and push back at me if this doesn't sound right, it's not in any sense a rejection of white hegemonic culture. It's a rejection of that culture's rejection of her.
Yes. I mean, Adrienne Kennedy is like, she's Adrienne Kennedy in several places, she's talked about her trips to Africa with her husband. And then she talked about her trips to Europe with her husband, right? Really sort of illuminating and opening up her understanding of the world. And many folks who have traveled if not, travel around the globe, but just travel outside of the confines of their own communities, right? So if you travel to another state, I just came back from New Orleans, right? And I was there during the hurricane.
Oh,
deal,
wow.
Right? My point though is that like going to New Orleans, right, opens up my own understanding of culture, of various cultures, even within the borders of the USA, right? And so Kennedy, like many other folks, is like, this is a beautiful world. And I just want to take part. And I want to become one of the folks who sort of inhabit the world, right? But because of colonialism, and I'm using colonialism as a direct line to racism and classism and so forth and gender dynamics, right? And I'm thinking about Kennedy's work specifically in naming colonialism as a direct line, that, there's the rejection that happens, there's the resistance, there's the push out, and more specific language, there's the effects of marginalization and ultimately oppression that happens. Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, I struggle with why, I mean, and, there's been a million excuses offered. You get people, you constantly hear, I'm sure you hear it as a professor, well, she's taught all the time in colleges. She's one of the, best American playwrights, but she doesn't get produced. Why is that? And do you think that's changing? I mean, I feel like, again, in the last couple of years, she's being showered with even more awards and feel people are finally paying attention. What do you think that's all about?
I mean, first and foremost, Kennedy, as a, I must say this. So my introduction to Adrienne Kennedy was in college, right? We read Funny House of a Negro. And at that time, I didn't know what was happening in this play. Like many of us are introduced to that particular play. And primarily in the context of African-American theater, right? Think about Kennedy as an early Black woman pioneer playwright. So that was my introduction. But I began to really take serious the work of Adrienne Kennedy when I got to my master's program at Miami University of Ohio. My advisor and mentor was one of the first scholars to write on Adrienne Kennedy. He was the first to edit and publish a book on Adrienne Kennedy, Intersecting Boundaries, the Theater of Adrienne Kennedy. And the essays in there, those critical essays that really explores Kennedy's work from a variety of ways, from, within the context of surrealism, German expressionism, Black feminism. And so you have like Ellen Diamond, an early pioneer of feminist theater theory. Then you have a few chapters later, you have Bell Hooks, a pioneer of Black feminist criticism, talking about the importance of Adrienne Kennedy's work. And so for me, when I think about the sort of the genealogy or the lineage of her body of work, I continuously think about the ways in which she is addressing issues that are still prevalent. I think about the ways in which she addresses issues that have happened and then shows up later. So that makes her very relevant to some degree. But we also have to think about your question. We also have to go back and recognize that the ways in which she writes doesn't fit with the mode of commercial theater. That's just what it is, right? Because there are many playwrights that we read and study who their aesthetic, their style, their writing, it doesn't fit with the mode of commercial theater. And that's a critique on commercial theater, not a critique on that particular artist, that playwright. So I just want to name that, right? And as an academic, right, as a professor, I mean, that's the very thing I teach. I say, let's talk about Broadway. Let's also critique Broadway. Let's talk about these plays. Let's talk about why these plays have not made it on the stage, right? Or why these plays exist within, off Broadway or off Broadway or in other underground theater arenas and so forth, right? And so more specifically to answer your question, I think it's just that folks, two things. Number one, her works, again, they don't fit with the mode of commercial theater to some degree, but she's been quite successful as well. So I do want to acknowledge that. Think about Signature Theater. Think about the festival that just took place last year. Was it early this year or last year? I can't remember. That celebrated Kennedy's body of work and also introduced some of her lesser known works and so forth. And think about the academic arena, right? Theater institutions within academia that study and stage Kennedy's works. Because also her works are just filled with so much that it gives us a lot to talk about, number one. And, I'm the kind of person, if the play doesn't give me a lot to talk about, I don't need to teach it. It just is what it is.
Right.
So if we can take this play and this playwright and talk 2 to 3 weeks about this person and their works, then it serves its purpose to some degree as well, right? And also recognizing how Adrienne Kennedy and her body work, Adrienne Kennedy as a person, but Adrienne Kennedy's work, which can stand alone, right? It crosses disciplinary bounds, right? So we can talk about Adrienne Kennedy from a feminist studies standpoint, gender studies standpoint, African-American studies standpoint, African diasporic standpoint, theater and performance studies standpoint, right? And so she sort of traverses these various terrains. And I think that's one of the reasons why she is highly regarded within academia.
Well, and let's not forget, and you already said it, haunted standpoint too. I mean, there's like a mystery. She's clearly a sucker for like classic Hollywood. I know this is documented, films and for mysteries and for romance. I mean, she's so romantic. That's the part that appeals to me. I mean, it's like, oh my God, we've all been there in different ways. And I don't mean that as an appropriative gesture as a cisgender white male, but you understand what it means to be in a situation where you're just so, like you said it, alive to the world and all that's beautiful in the world. And then somebody just steps on your puppy, it completely trashes your idea of what the world should be. And that's just heartrending for anybody. And she really is universal, I think, in that way.
Right. What's interesting is like I was looking at her semi-autobiographical, semi-memoir-like book, People Who Led to My Plays. And she talks about, and what I find interesting is that book is written in a very kind of fragmented way as well. And she talked about like growing up with her family, and she talked about spirituals that she was listening to. And I was like, this is really interesting to think about Adrienne Kennedy, this playwright whose mind is so brilliant that, like many of us, she grew up singing spirituals that many of us know, within the African-American context, right? So she's very much just like your average person. And I think that her works illuminate that, right? It's particularly thinking about Mom, How to Meet the Beatles, where she's fascinated with certain people, or she talks about not having money, right? And like, I only got $500. This has got to last. I got to get this scholarship or this prize, this Guggenheim prize, because if I don't, how are we going to make it? Oh, but I am getting money from my ex-husband who's sending, money once a month, right? Like very much in the sense that she's like an everyday person that you can relate to as well, right? Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about in terms of the relating her to the world, and Madison sometimes thinks it's the world, but for purposes of the next question, it is. Relating her to our Madison audience and audience engagement, what are some of the things that you've been working on that are going to help bring that to reality?
So I have a couple of things. Well, this podcast is one of them, right? So make sure we name that. And then there's a couple of things lined up. So next week, I'm scheduled to have a conversation with Adrienne Kennedy's son, Adam Kennedy, who I want to make sure we name is a co-author in this play. He's a co-playwright with Adrienne Kennedy in this play. But this is also Adam's second play that he co-wrote with his mother, Adrienne. The first one was Sleep Deprivation Chamber, which chronicles his experience and her experience as well as his mother with police brutality. Right. Again, thinking about how Adrienne Kennedy and also her son, Adam, they are, dealing with topics that are not necessarily new, but that sort of just continues to travel throughout time, right? From that point on in his life, early in his life, to where we are now. These topics are not new. And so in many ways, we think about like, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And I teach hashtag Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement in theater, right? How playwrights have taken up these issues within their works. And Adrienne Kennedy very much fits within that rubric with some of her own works, but also specifically with the Sleep Deprivation Chamber play, right? And so forth. So I just want to make sure we acknowledge that Adrienne Kennedy is, co-playwright with Adrienne in those plays. But so in addition to my conversation with Adam Kennedy, happening next week, I'm also hosting 3 different post-show discussions. The first one is Adrienne Kennedy and Black women playwrights, and that's going to be with several Black women scholars who specialize in African-American theater and performance. So that includes Sandra Adele, Adana Forsgren, And then there's the second panel that's going to be popular culture in the 1960s. And that's going to be with Donald Gagnon and Kristen Mandrakia. And they're going to talk about everything from the Beatles to race politics to the changing of the times in the 1960s. And then the third panel is going to be, I'm really, really excited about this panel. It's going to be, I think, writing ourselves into history, Black women and autobiographical writing. And that's going to be with Omayemi Artisha Green and Joanne Braxton, two feminist scholars whose work looked at the ways in which women use theater and writing specifically to insert their lives into the larger canon of literature. And so thinking about how Adrienne Kennedy does that with this play. Yeah.
Oh
so those are some of the things that are coming up. Yeah. I'm excited. I'm really excited.
Yeah, this is just great. And on your last point, I want to call the audience's attention to another thing, which you've been too modest to mention, which is your fabulous program note, which you can also find at Madison 365.
Yeah.
And you talk about, in terms of your last panel, this quote has stuck with me. I even wrote it down about that this play represents, as does so much of her work, a coming to consciousness of self in a world that does not treasure, nurture, or protect Black women. Right. End quote. It's just really there, I'm guessing, in at least that third of the three panels you mentioned.
Yes, that quote actually is pulled from Joanne Braxton's article. She's on the third panel. It's pulled from her article. I think it's something like Black Women, Literature, and Autobiographical Writing. And Joanne Braxton is a specialist in, she's a professor emeritus at William & Mary. And her specialization is the ways in which Black women use literature and other forms of production, that could be music and art and so forth, to write their lives. This, and I think it's important to note that this is something we're going to talk about on that panel, that, the play, Mom, How Did You Meet the Beatles? It reads easy, right? You read, you're like, oh, this is a really easy play. But then you think about, what's missing from the page that pops up onto the stage. And when you see the play and you see the ways in which, Marty and Baron are able to nuance those moments that are perhaps, hurtful, those vulnerable moments that Adrienne experiences, you see something very different, right? And you get not necessarily different, but you get a deeper, more critical perspective of Adrienne Kennedy's experience, especially as an early playwright, to use her own words, in search of fame and fortune. And that, I think, is really important when you think about Black women and the ways in which they use art, specifically some form of literature, to write themselves into the canon. Well, yeah. More specifically into history, I would say. Yeah.
Well, and you're reminding me, I'm glad you brought up Sleep Deprivation Chamber. I mean, that's another one I could have mentioned with Ohio State Murders, because there's one where you have the cultural, on the one hand, you got this weird cultural, not weird, but I mean, it's just the rehearsals for a play going on in one space, which right. seems like this traditional mainstream culture, just, nice little college rehearsal. And then underneath it, to your point, the things that are missing, the things that are not spoken, the things that erupt, and make us confront all the stuff that we tend to brush to the side.
Yeah.
Well, no brushing to the side of Adrienne Kennedy with you involved in this production. And I'm so grateful for that. As we wrap up, are there things that you're hoping, Khalid, from having worked on this play, from having loved this playwright and taught her, that you're hoping our audiences will take away from their experience with this play and with the things around the play?
Oh, that's a really good question. I will say this. Baron and I talked about this early on. Adrienne Kennedy started writing in the early 60s with her first play, 1964, produced by Edward Albee in New York. That was Funny House of a Negro. Many of the playwrights that were writing around that time are no longer with us. That includes Amiri Baraka, at that time Leroy Jones. That includes Edward Albee. That includes some of the other pioneers and theater makers, not just simply playwrights, but from Ellen Stewart at La Mama to, I'm thinking about Judith, Melina, forgot her husband's name, her partner's name, the Living Theater, many of those folks, right? They're just no longer with us. You know, they were up in age and they're dying, and Adrienne Kennedy's up in age. But the fact that she's still writing, right? Like her most recent play, 2018, I think it was He Brought Her Home in a Box, right? And all of the works that exist, you know, in between. And the fact that the theater world is still celebrating her as a living playwright. And so my students, oftentimes when I teach them, they think of these playwrights as, you know, like, for them, there's no distance between them and Shakespeare, right? It's like they're all in the same time zone, right? But I'm like, y'all, she's still living. Like her son, you can follow him on social media, and her grandson and his writings about her. And more emphatically, you can actually read the works that she's just written, in which she's responding to what's happening in the world today during your lifetime, right? And so I think it's a treasure and a treat that we have this pioneer, because oftentimes we think about pioneer, we think about legacy, we think about innovators, but most of the time they're dead and they're gone. But we have this pioneer, this innovator, and she's still with us. And the fact that we get to celebrate her while also taking in the works that she's given us, I think that is amazing. I think that's what I want folks to walk away with. I as a historian, right? I'm a trained historian, theater historian specifically, and I think about dates a lot. I don't know dates, but I think about them a lot. And I'm always like, gosh, 1964 was such a long time ago in terms of my own life. But 2018, that's when I started here at Columbia, right? And the fact that she's still putting pen to paper, I think that is amazing. And that's what I want the folks to sort of walk away with. Yeah.
You've just given me goosebumps. This is why I love dramaturgs who really do care about our history, our theater history, and making it live and making it real. And you've certainly done that today, and you've been doing that in this production. Thank you so much for joining us, Khalid.
Thank you for having me.
That's going to be it for this episode of Theater Forward, a conversation about theater in Wisconsin, the Midwest, and America. I'm Mike Fisher. Our podcast, as always, is produced by Scott Hayden, and you can follow us or share your thoughts on Facebook and Twitter at Theater Forward, as always, spelled with an ER. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you might tune in. And be sure, of course, to leave us a stellar review. My guest performance today warrants it, people. We are grateful to have you listening, and we'll be back soon with another Theater Forward conversation.